There is a photograph of Audie Murphy that has circulated for decades, one taken not long before his death. In it, he looks tired. Not tired in the ordinary sense of a man who has worked a long day, but tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has stopped expecting anyone to help him set it down. It is a strange image to reconcile with the legend, because the legend insists that Audie Murphy was invincible. He was the boy who charged tanks, who mowed down waves of enemy soldiers from atop a burning tank destroyer, who came home with more medals pinned to his chest than any American soldier in history. And yet, when you look closely at the last decade of his life, a very different picture begins to emerge. Not the picture of a hero resting on his laurels, but the picture of a man quietly unraveling, surrounded by people who either didn't notice or didn't care to help, until one rainy morning in 1971 put an end to the story in a way that, the more you examine it, looks less like an accident and more like the final, almost inevitable chapter of a much darker tale. This is the story of Audie Murphy, and why his death may be one of the strangest unresolved cases in American celebrity history. To understand how Audie Murphy's life ended, it helps to understand how it began, because the two bookends of his existence are connected by a thread of deprivation that never really left him, no matter how famous he became. He was born on June 20, 1925, in a tenant farming community in Hunt County, Texas, the sixth or seventh child, depending on which family account you believe, in a household that would eventually include 12 children crammed into whatever shack the family was sharecropping that season. His father, Emmett Murphy, was a restless and unreliable man who came and went from the household as he pleased, leaving his wife Josie to somehow keep a dozen children fed on the wages of cotton picking. Audie left school sometime around the 5th grade, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the family needed every set of hands they could get in the fields. He learned to shoot not as a hobby, but as a survival skill, hunting squirrels and rabbits, so his younger siblings would have something to eat. When his mother died in 1941, something in Audie changed permanently. He was 16 years old and already functioning as a surrogate parent to his younger siblings, several of whom were placed in an orphanage after her death because there was simply no one left capable of caring for them. Those who knew him later in life would say that this loss never fully healed, that it left a kind of permanent ache underneath everything else that happened to him. The war, the fame, the marriages, the money troubles. He was a boy who had already lost almost everything before he ever set foot on a battlefield. And that detail matters enormously when you try to understand what came after. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Audie tried to enlist and was turned away by branch after branch of the military for being too short, too slim, too young looking. His sister falsified paperwork to add a year to his age, and eventually the army took him. He shipped out to North Africa, then Sicily, then the brutal, grinding campaign at Anzio, and finally into France, rising through the ranks with a speed that reflected both his skill and the appalling casualty rates among the men above him. The event that made him a household name occurred on January 26, 1945, near the village of Holtzwihr in the Colmar pocket of eastern France. His company was being overrun by German tanks and infantry in brutal winter conditions. Murphy ordered his men to fall back into the tree line while he stayed behind alone at a forward position, using a field telephone to direct artillery fire onto positions that were, by his own later admission, dangerously close to where he was standing. When a burning tank destroyer nearby was abandoned by its crew, Murphy climbed onto the wreck, mounted its machine gun, and held off the advancing German force for the better part of an hour, wounded in the leg, exposed on top of a vehicle that could have exploded at any moment. By the time his ammunition ran out and the enemy was forced to retreat, witnesses estimated he had killed or wounded well over 200 enemy soldiers, though Murphy himself was famously reluctant to put a number on it. For this single act, he received the Medal of Honor. By the war's end, he had accumulated something like 33 individual awards and decorations, a total that made him, by most accounts, the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. He came home a national symbol before he had even turned 21 years old. Here is where the story starts to bend away from the simple, triumphant version most people know. Audie Murphy came home to a country that desperately wanted a hero, and he was handed that role with almost no preparation for what it would cost him. He appeared on the cover of Life magazine, which caught the eye of the actor James Cagney, who invited the young veteran out to Hollywood and offered to help train him as an actor. For a period, Murphy essentially lived out of a gym, sleeping on borrowed floors, trying to learn a trade that had nothing to do with anything he had ever known. When the arrangement with Cagney fell apart after a couple of years, Murphy was largely on his own in an industry built on artifice, populated by people who had no framework for understanding what he had actually been through overseas. He nevertheless persisted, working with an acting coach, collaborating with the writer David Speck McClure on a memoir called To Hell and Back, published in 1949, which became a bestseller and eventually the basis for a film in which Murphy played himself. That movie, released in 1955, became Universal Pictures' highest-grossing release for 2 decades, until it was finally surpassed by Jaws. Murphy went on to appear in more than 36 films over the following years, most of them westerns, roles that suited his quiet, controlled screen presence. It is worth pausing here to consider just how strange this trajectory really was. Most young men who survive intense combat are given time to decompress, to reintegrate slowly into ordinary civilian rhythms, surrounded by people who understand what they have been through. Murphy was given almost the opposite experience. Within a matter of months, he went from directing artillery fire onto his own position in a frozen French forest to standing under studio lights, memorizing dialogue, and being coached on how to hit his marks for a camera. There was no transitional period, no space to grieve or process, only an accelerating demand that he perform a new kind of role, this time playing versions of American toughness for an audience that had no real understanding of what toughness had actually cost him. Several people who observed him during this stretch noted that he seemed to treat acting less as a passion and more as the only trade available to a young man with a 10th grade education and a famous face, a pragmatic decision rather than an artistic calling. But those who worked alongside him consistently described a man who never seemed entirely comfortable inside his own success. He avoided the party circuit, disliked the performative glamour of the industry, and by several accounts carried a pistol with him more or less constantly, a habit his first wife, the actress Wanda Hendricks, would later say unsettled her deeply throughout their brief and troubled marriage. He married Hendricks in 1949. The union collapsed within 2 years. He remarried almost immediately to a former airline stewardess named Pamela Archer, and this second marriage produced 2 sons and lasted the rest of his life, though even Pamela would later acknowledge that living with Murphy meant living with a man who was, in some fundamental sense, still fighting a war that had technically ended years earlier. This is the part of Murphy's story that deserves far more attention than it typically receives, because it is arguably the most important thing about him, more important even than the medals. Long before the term post-traumatic stress disorder existed in the American vocabulary, Audie Murphy was living with what soldiers of his generation called battle fatigue or shell shock, and what we would now unmistakably recognize as severe combat trauma. He suffered from insomnia so persistent that he sometimes went days without real rest. He experienced recurring nightmares, and by multiple accounts, flashbacks vivid enough that they left him disoriented in his waking life. He developed a dependence on prescription sleeping medication, and at one point locked himself alone in a hotel room for roughly a week to force himself through withdrawal, refusing to ask for outside help even as he suffered through it. What makes this remarkable is not simply that Murphy suffered, but that he talked about it publicly, at a time when doing so was considered a mark of weakness or even cowardice for a man of his stature. He pushed for greater research into the psychological toll of combat, and specifically warned that the young men returning from Korea and later Vietnam would carry the same invisible wounds he carried, wounds the country was not prepared to acknowledge, let alone treat. In hindsight, Murphy was decades ahead of the institutions meant to serve him. The Department of Veterans Affairs would not begin seriously reckoning with PTSD as a diagnosable condition until years after his death. He was, in effect, screaming into a void about a problem the country would not have language for until long after he was gone. And here lies one layer of the mystery that people rarely stop to sit with. How much of what looked like erratic, difficult, even reckless behavior in Murphy's later years was in fact undiagnosed and untreated trauma, hiding in plain sight, misread by the press and even by some of his own family as simple temperament or the ordinary wear of a demanding career. The gambling, the explosive temper. The 1970 arrest in Burbank after a violent confrontation with a dog trainer, in which Murphy was accused of firing a shot during the altercation, charges that were ultimately dropped, but that nonetheless made headlines and further chipped away at the polished image the public still wanted to believe in. None of these episodes exist in isolation. Taken together, they paint the picture of a man in genuine crisis, one that the culture around him had neither the vocabulary nor the will to properly address. Consider, too, the sheer loneliness embedded in the way Murphy handled his own suffering. A man surrounded by studio executives, co-stars, ranch hands, and a wife and children still chose, when the withdrawal symptoms from sleeping medication became unbearable, to isolate himself completely rather than seek clinical help. That single choice says as much about the era as it does about Murphy himself. In the culture of the 1950s and 1960s, admitting to a psychological breaking point, especially for a man whose entire public identity rested on physical courage, was treated as a kind of betrayal of the image people needed him to embody. So instead of walking into a hospital, he locked a door and endured it alone, trusting no one enough, or perhaps fearing the consequences of trusting anyone, to let them see him at his most vulnerable. It is a small, devastating detail, easy to skim past in a list of biographical facts, but it captures something essential about the gap between the war hero the public adored and the exhausted, frightened man living underneath that image. It also raises an uncomfortable question that rarely gets asked directly. If a man of Murphy's fame, resources, and public platform could not find or would not seek adequate help for this condition, what chance did the millions of far less visible veterans returning from the same war, or the wars that followed, actually have? Murphy's private struggle was not an isolated anomaly. It was a preview of a crisis that would eventually be measured in the hundreds of thousands of veterans across multiple generations, and Murphy, whether he intended to or not, became one of the first recognizable faces willing to admit, in public, that the war did not end when the shooting stopped. Layered on top of the psychological toll was a financial situation that grew increasingly precarious as the 1960s wore on, and this is where the story takes on an almost tragic inevitability. Murphy had invested heavily in ranch land in California and Arizona, where he bred quarter horses and pursued racing as both a passion and, he hoped, a source of steady income. For a while it brought him genuine joy, but it also devoured money at an alarming rate, and Murphy, whether out of restlessness, poor judgment, or simple bad luck, kept doubling down on new ventures rather than pulling back. The most devastating blow came in 1968, when he lost $250,000 in a failed Algerian oil investment, a deal that by several accounts he had entered with far too little scrutiny of the people involved. The loss triggered a cascade of financial trouble, including scrutiny from the Internal Revenue Service over unpaid taxes. And yet, in the middle of all this financial desperation, Murphy turned down lucrative endorsement offers from cigarette and alcohol companies, reportedly because he did not want to encourage young fans who admired him to take up habits he considered destructive. It is a small detail, but it tells you something important about the man. Whatever turmoil he carried privately, he still held himself to a code of public responsibility that plenty of people in his position would have abandoned without a second thought. There is something almost painfully symbolic in the shape these financial troubles took. A man who had grown up picking cotton for $1 a day, who had once measured survival in rabbits caught and mouths fed, spent much of his adult life chasing bigger and bigger financial swings, as though trying to outrun the poverty of his childhood so decisively that it could never catch him again. The ranches, the racehorses, the oil ventures, all of it reads less like the behavior of a reckless gambler and more like the behavior of a man haunted by scarcity, unable to simply enjoy the comfortable, if not lavish, income his acting career provided, because some part of him never quite believed the money was safe. Friends and business associates who knew him during this period often remarked that he seemed to trust his instincts on a battlefield far more than he trusted the advice of financial professionals, a pattern that served him brilliantly in France in 1945 and served him very poorly in boardrooms and investment deals 2 decades later. By the start of the 1970s, Murphy was a man stretched thin in every direction. He was still acting, though the westerns that had built his career were falling out of fashion. He was still managing horse and ranch operations that never quite turned the corner into profitability. He was still fighting off IRS pressure. And he was still, by every indication, wrestling privately with the psychological aftermath of a war that had ended 26 years earlier. It was into this state of compounding pressure that he boarded a small twin-engine aircraft on the morning of May 28, 1971, for what should have been a routine business flight.